So let me say good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gordon McCauley. I am the President and CEO of AdMare BioInnovations. Welcoming you on behalf of the Canadian Science Policy Conference. I think our colleagues there are having some technical difficulties, so we're just going to drive on. This panel is really meant to be an effective investor dialogue about the current environment for life science investing in Canada. Really trying to answer a deceptively simple question. How do we ensure that our most compelling life science companies have the resources they need to innovate and to scale, and particularly in the context of post-pandemic economic recovery? We have a terrific panel that is deeply expert in these issues. Inès, Holzbaur, the co-founder and managing director of AmorChem in Montreal, and a partner with us recently in the creation of a company in Montreal that we're very excited about called Rulleau, and really a demonstration that the pandemic shouldn't slow any of us down. Dion, Madsen, partner of Amplitude Venture Capital, a widely respected leader in the space. Laurence, Rulleau, a partner at CTI Life Sciences, also a partner of ours in the creation of Fine Therapeutics. Again, a really effective demonstration that the pandemic shouldn't slow any of us down. And Didier, Leconte, the Vice President of Investments, Life Sciences, and Fund Management at the phone, solidarité, FDQ. So our agenda today is I'm going to make a couple of introductory comments. I'm then going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and make a few comments about their perspective on the issue that we're discussing today. And then we're just going to have a dialogue amongst us around those issues. There is certainly a desire to respond to questions, so please feel free to use the question function, and we'll do our best to respond to those as quickly as we can. So with that, let me just make a couple of comments about where we find ourselves 9 months into this pandemic and nearly 12 months since the virus first emerged. And I think most of us would see or agree that there have been kind of 3 stages of this pandemic for all of us. There was the alarm stage, where we were all kind of on a war footing. We were all coming together and trying to figure out how we could be helpful, what do we have in terms of excess PPE or other capacity to help out in the process. That gave way slowly to kind of an acceptance phase, where we started to recognize that there were foundational changes going to result from this pandemic, and we were dealing with a whole bunch of unfamiliar issues. How do we work from home? How do we learn to look at ourselves at Zoom while we're trying to talk and interact with others? And what sort of changes, we started to ask ourselves, what sort of changes would this cause? And I'd argue now we're at the adaptation phase. We're accepting that there are long-term impacts in the way that we do business, the way that we do science, and that we really need to grapple with those and understand. And certainly, when I think about the companies that we work with, either in the company creation phase with academic scientists or young biotech companies, or with our scale-up partners, whether they be companies we're working directly with or tenants in one of our facilities, or even in our training business, they've all followed that path pretty simply. In the alarm phase, it was all about what sort of excess PPE do we have and so on. In the acceptance phase, everybody started looking at their portfolio and their science and tried to figure out if there was something there that could possibly have an impact on COVID or pandemic related issues and so on. And now most of our partners are in that adaptation phase, saying, okay, what does this mean longer term? How do we raise money? I mean, one of the interesting ironies we might talk about is that Zoom in a funny way has made fundraising much more efficient certainly from a company perspective, and not needing to run all over the world. But there's an open question there as to whether or not you can really establish relationships by Zoom. And I think all of my colleagues on this panel would agree that relationships are key to any sort of venture capital investment. Other questions people are asking themselves, what does this mean for existing portfolios? What's the appetite for new names and new science? And does this change our thinking as it relates to the kind of science that we're interested in? Are we thinking more about infectious disease? Are we thinking more about antimicrobial resistance and so on? So I think there's a lot of questions in the ecosystem, certainly amongst the companies that we partner with. And that's why I'm so excited about the panel that we have to talk through these issues today. Obviously, the Canadian Science Policy Conference is a public policy focused event, and in particular, a public science policy focused event. And from adMare's perspective, we're the bridge between that public policy and life science commercial innovation. And of course, we all know that the fuel that drives that innovation from a commercial perspective is venture capital. So that's why I'm delighted to have this group here. And perhaps I might start, Inès, with you and ask you to introduce yourself and your firm and give your reflection on these issues.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. We're at AmorChem. We're a venture capital fund based in Montreal. We have roughly $87 million under management. We specialize in biotech, specifically biopharmaceuticals or drug discovery. We invest in pre-seed opportunities, which is to say we look for promising academic projects. We use a certain amount of time to confirm their commercial potential, and then we seed small companies that we use to spin off. We have to date, we have made 33 investments in such academic projects, and we've spun out 10 companies. We have 2 funds under management, one that started in 2011 and the other one in 2017. And our major backers are the Quebec government, Fonds de solidarité FTQ, Merck, and Fonds d'Action. So if I look at the pandemic, I think, well, first of all, there has never been such a spotlight shone on our industry. Nobody ever spoke about life sciences, or not really, before, and now we've become, the most popular kid in school. And I think that the ecosystem at large has taken that opportunity that it offers us for visibility very well. And I've never seen so much dialogue between different stakeholders, public and private, in the industry in order to find solutions to some of the problems that the ecosystem faces. I think that it also provides us a very nice opportunity for innovation within the ecosystem, but also internally in all of our funds in order to increase efficiency and make different decisions in terms of how we invest and how we move forward. It's shed light definitely on different problems. Some of them can be resolved by private capital, but some of them are outside the scope of private capital and fall into more of a public policy kind of situation. So I think that all in all, this will help us if we use it properly, and I think we are. This will help us to become a better, more solid ecosystem.
That was a great introduction. Thank you. And Dion, why don't I turn to you? You're coming to us from the Bay Area and have perhaps a slightly different perspective. Given that, how do you view the situation? So please introduce yourself and your firm and give us that perspective.
Sure. Dion Madsen, partner and co-founder of Amplitude Ventures. We're a fund that's focused on precision medicine, primarily on Canadian opportunities, and helping to grow real Canadian companies based upon the innovation that we're seeing coming out of the tremendous scientists and researchers that exist in Canada. Our view, it's really interesting, Gord, that you brought this up. My entry into this career came when I was working with RBC Capital Partners and was asked to do diligence on a vaccine company in Edmonton. And just the light bulb went off, like, hey, I can do well while doing good. Oh, this would be awesome. This is where I want to spend the rest of my career. And that led to me being the CFO there. And then later in my career, I had the opportunity to head up investor relations at Chiron, where we had the misfortune of having a contamination issue in our flu vaccine factory, a company that was delivering half of the influenza vaccine to the United States, and we had a disruption in our production and couldn't deliver that year. So it gave me a pretty good understanding of the challenges of producing a vaccine, a new novel vaccine, not just one that was clinically proven, but also manufacturing that at scale and taking that to the masses. So when COVID hit, I sent around a quite early and probably a memo that was viewed quite skeptically about the impact of this. I was pretty alarmist about what I was seeing in terms of transmissibility and just didn't feel like we were prepared. And I have to say that most of the things that I talked about in terms of the impact of the economy happened. The one thing that didn't happen that I thought it would really take down the market, and the financial markets have stayed robust, and in fact are slightly ahead even where they were pre-pandemic. So I think that really reflected the massive shift that went on in the economy, where we shifted towards knowledge-based industries very rapidly. Those things that can be done remotely, we've all become quite adept at Zoom. But also the focus that brought to our industry and the potential for cures. I think you had asked early on, Gord, about our view on whether our investment strategy changed or shifted into novel antimicrobials or antibiotics or antivirals, and I think we've looked at that area pretty consistently. We've looked at vaccine technologies pretty consistently, but when something like this happens, you can't just pivot your investment strategy and all of a sudden say, yeah, we're just going to put all the rest of the fund in that area, because it can be transient. And as you see in the case of AbCellera's partnership with Lilly, is that there's no guarantee of success, and many other parties are also competing for what we all hope to be a temporary market. So it didn't shift our strategy. We have looked at a lot of companies. I think what would be really interesting to us is investments where there's a broad platform technology that does address some of these emergent threats. And this is a part of it. And I think that we're looking for opportunities that have that long tail around them, where it's a tremendous platform and this is just a component of it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. In particular, I had a call yesterday where I had the opportunity to rant at somebody who made the comment, well, nobody could have anticipated a pandemic. And I said, I don't want to sound like I'm that smart, because I'm not. But you know what? A lot of people anticipated it. We just chose to ignore it, which is a whole different conversation. It's interesting how people rationalize things. Laurence, you have a perspective that is certainly North American, but you do a fair bit in Europe as well. So maybe you'd share with us, obviously introduce yourself and CPI, but also give us a little bit of that perspective too.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Gord. Thank you for having me on this panel. Laurence Rulleau, partner at CTI Life Science, and as the name say, we are a VC fund investing in life science, mostly in therapeutic, but also in device and AI, but mostly in therapeutics, focused in Canada. We do, as you mentioned, Gord, brought some assets from Europe to Canada to build some new company. We also built some assets in Canadian University, obviously. The European part has been more challenging in the last 9 months, I will say. There's a certain amount of due diligence that you cannot do over Zoom. So that part has a little bit slowed down. The one we did with you guys as a partnership, as you know, was in the process before the pandemic strike. So that was a bit different. In terms of, global comment about how did that pandemic affect us and our thinking and our view, I will agree with what Dion say. We cannot pivot and change the strategy overnight. We just can't. Having said that, we have to also realize what's going on and trying to prevent is a big word, but trying to see what can come in the future. So the platform approach for vaccine, where one day another antigen will come, another virus, and you can just put that on your platform and the vaccine will go easier, faster, whatever. Same thing with antibodies. I think we're all more favorable and inclined to look at those. Obviously, I think there's a full debate to have about the infectious disease, because infectious disease can strike anytime, as we can see. and there's little going on in terms of supporting new antibiotics. So, and I think there's a lot of role for the policy and government to help going back into that direction. In terms of our own portfolio, I like what you said about the first stage, what you call alarm and the acceptance phase. I will call that also a defensive phase. I think we all have to turn and say, okay, we have to protect our company, portfolio company. How do we support them? What do they need? What do we have to plan for? And now we're going to the next step, and we're going more, okay, how can we do other investments? So, and I think it's important that we are at that phase. I think it's optimistic and it's good.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to come back to that after we ask Didier to introduce himself, because I think that's really important for scientists, public policymakers to understand the portfolio manager's perspective. You have to worry about the portfolio you have, and how do you assess how you might think about additions to that. But first, so Didier, you again come probably with a more global perspective from a fund management point of view than everybody, because you do both direct investments and also fund-to-fund investments. So maybe you can give us a perspective, obviously on the phone, but also of how you view those two different worlds, the investments and fund-to-fund kind of investment.
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation, and glad to join a stellar panel. Actually, I have a bias. We are an investor in each one of the previous panelists, and some others as well. And also involved with so I'm Didier Leconte. I'm Vice President Investment, Life Science. In our words, life science is essentially a biopharmaceutical investment, venture cap investment, but also in charge of the fund-of-fund strategy. So we are a liberal sponsor fund. We invest in 25 sectors, but a fund has a long history of successful and support of the biotechnology industry, having invested now over $1.6 billion since the late 1980s. We invest perhaps in average 100 million every year, half directly in companies and half in funds. Portfolio is 22 companies and 8 general partners, so funds we partner with. So the picture now is kind of interesting, because I echo the fact that these industry is now more popular than it was before in terms of investor in later stage. But as like many investors, we looked first at our own portfolio, as Laurence said, really making sure they had the ammunition to move forward for a couple of months or years. The reality is that the COVID-19 has an impact, but the impact is actually marginal if you look at the inherent risk of investing in biotechnologies. So it provides something in addition, but in fact it does not really change the result that is, a company will go pretty well if it has its product approved. And what we have witnessed so far through our exposure to funds is that we still receive distribution. Canada has been exposed to the 2 largest IPOs in biotechnology in history, actually, this year. So there's still an appetite. So the problem we see as a long-term investor is that, for sure, like my colleagues, we did not change or shift our investment strategy. But this situation brings a couple of questions. We are trying to do with the COVID now something that we know for sure normally take years, and we are trying to do it very fast, and now we see some eventually failure, which is normal. But the question we have, and we don't have the whole answer, is how can we be more prepared in the future to answer these? And the only reason, and the only perhaps first part of the answer is, continue investing in research is the key part, because if we don't have the knowledge, we can't apply it. So that really, and we have to think about I would say the business model of some indication and some disease. And I know, Gord, you wanna deep dive on that. So that's the overall thinking now of what we are. We see a really thriving industry. We see companies going pretty well. We see new appetite from new investors. The risks are the same, but we have to think about how we could make sure that this will not happen again. And that's a pretty difficult question.
That's really interesting. So you've each actually introduced really interesting topics to dig into. So let's do that. And I want to just return for a moment to that defending the portfolio kind of question, because one of the things that we're kind of concerned about is that a lot of the companies we work with and most of your portfolio, they've got a defined amount of capital to apply to the development of their assets. However, the pandemic has slowed that down. Certainly if you're in clinical trials somewhere or trying to recruit for clinical trials, that's really slowed things down. So when you look at your portfolios, are you worried about companies able to meet their milestones given the impact of the pandemic short term, or to Didier's point, longer term, is it just not going to be that big of an issue because we generally speaking have a longer term perspective than most industries? Didier, why don't you take that one, because you kind of introduced the topic, and then we'll go around the table. Well,
touching wood, so far, no impact at all. And again, we have some companies in phase 3, for instance, and the delay is actually marginal. The additional delay because of COVID and the additional cost because of COVID is actually marginal. There is a bit of delay, there is a bit of cost, but it's nothing compared to the global risk of doing that kind of investment.
And how about you? I mean, because we spend a lot of time together in the earliest stages of this business. Is that a concern that you have about your portfolio, or just in general?
Well, we were very concerned at first because university labs shut down, and we weren't sure when they were going to reopen and at what capacity. And we do all our research, or most of our research, in university labs. So this was at first in that panic mode, definitely something that was top of mind, and keeping reserves for delayed projects was important there. The second concern we have, and probably continue to have, although to a lesser extent than we did at first, is that at our first stage of investment, we do alone mostly. Generally, we're a sole investor, so we only depend on our own capacity to deploy capital. But when we seed company, when we spin them off, and when they eventually raise seed financing and Series A financing, then we're very dependent on our co-investing partners. And they have to raise their own funds in order to be ready to invest in the companies that we create. And the concern there was that anybody who was on the road, would they be able to raise enough capital in the timelines that we needed them to in order to be able to support our companies? And would foreign investors who were also starting to be interested in Montreal-based companies, would they continue to do international investing, considering the difficulties in travel and everything else? So far, we haven't seen any negative impact, and I know that some funds are still on the road for fundraising, and I wish them all the luck in the world, because that's not ever an easy exercise. But I haven't seen a huge impact in the availability of later stage capital, which was our main concern.
Dion, how about you on that question?
I think we've seen some slowdowns. One of the things that we did quite early on in addressing the pandemic is switch our focus away from those later stage companies that had a lot more clinical trial exposure to start looking at more early stage companies that didn't have that. And so we haven't seen that much impact in our current portfolio, because most of it's preclinical. We do manage some other assets that do have clinical exposure, and I think we've seen some slowdown there, especially for those clinical studies that require some kind of in-person, in-hospital treatment around it. We've clearly seen an impact in commercial companies that have that are selling medical devices or med tech, because the number of procedures have gone down, and their access to sales or customers to complete sales has been a little bit more difficult. On the fundraising side, to address Inez's point, it's actually gotten easier to a certain extent. So when Repair did its IPO, for example, they didn't have to get on a single airplane. They just did all their meetings from Lloyd's living room. So, you know, we're seeing that as well. I think Laurence would echo that it's actually a little bit easier to have the meetings and do the diligence. But what's harder is building the new relationships. So anyone that hasn't met with you before is probably not going to put you in their process because they still have not exactly changed their process. I think there's been this belief, and I think it probably exists at a company level as well, but there's a belief that, oh, we're just around the corner. And I don't know where they're getting that information from, maybe the president of the United States who keeps saying it, but there's a sort of belief that we don't have to radically change the way that we do things because in just a short period of time, we'll be back to normal. And so I think that a lot of companies and a lot of investors, institutional investors and others have not fully changed over or adapted. I think we're going to see a little difference in the next quarter or two. I think people are finally like, hey, we have to get back on track and we have to figure out how this new reality works. And then when things change, then we'll go back, but let's not anticipate that they're changing.
I think that's really interesting. And I want to come back to that in a minute because I think how young companies in particular, emerging companies need to think about establishing those relationships in this environment is a really important question. But I also think it's interesting that on embarrassed, I hadn't thought about the first part of your comment that in a peculiar way, the pandemic could have helped earlier stage companies as it relates to the availability of capital because they don't bear that clinical risk, which is of course historically exactly the opposite of what we're used to. That's interesting. Laurence, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I would say it's a different risk. I would not say there's no risk. To go back on clinical trial, we are a co-investor with that phase 3 that Didier was referring to. And yes, there's little delays and little financing burden, but it took a lot of adaptation. When you have 6,000 patients in 29 countries and then the world is shutting down, you have to adapt very fast. So we were, I would not say we were lucky, but we were very proactive in shipping the drugs everywhere, changing the doctor visit to phone visit and stuff like that. But there are impacts and it takes time and energy to do so. So that's on the clinical stage. On the preclinical, you know, as you say, Gord, in your introductory comment, they have a certain amount of capital and they have a certain amount of time to achieve those milestones with that capital. So you don't want to have too much delay. And at some point, we had to adapt in the preclinical. For example, some of the work done in local CRO, we have to move them to CRO in Finland where they were not close because we didn't want to have too much delays. So there are impact at the preclinical level too. And I'm looking forward to repatriate all that work back in the CRO in Canada, but we have to adapt to make sure that we don't have too much delay. So that's on the portfolio side. On the fundraising, totally agree with you, Dion. We are raising our third fund right now. The relationship that are there and exist for years are there. They know us, and Zoom is doing perfectly fine with that. But when you try to raise money outside a new relationship right now, it's not a walk in the park. I just think.
Yeah, interesting.
Gord, if I may add to the risk, what you know, I think if I look at many funds and companies, I think the most important risk is actually being, in this time of uncertainty, is being too prudent and conservative. Meaning, if the company is funded, it's actually slowing expenses, is actually slowing or postponing recruitment, which is a tendency that investor will generally take because they want to make sure that the company can move through. But this is a business where, you know, if only when you reach a milestone, you can get to the next one. So you need to find a balance in between, you know, managing the cash position of the companies, but also continue advancing. And that is where you need to find that DNA of investor willing to take risk and moving forward.
Yeah. It's interesting. My colleagues will tell you that one of my favorite rants is that time is the enemy. Right? Money's not the challenge. Time is the enemy. That's a huge issue. Let's return to the discussion that Inès kind of introduced in her comments about the vitality of the industry and the essential nature of the industry. And really, given that we're talking with a broader public policy audience out there, certainly, as Inès said, we've seen the industry respond. We've seen the critical value it can deliver, and it's really quite stunning. I mean, beyond with a history in vaccines, to have seen the progress made over the course of 9 months is incredible. Even if it's not all successful, that's not the point. Just the fact that so much focus could be brought so quickly is really amazing. But so if we understand that, I'm pretty sure we would all agree that as we think about economic recovery, this is an industry we should be encouraging public policymakers to double down on, because these are literally the proverbial jobs of the future. So what sort of things from a public policy perspective do you think would either specifically encourage the creation of more scalable companies in this space, or perhaps more importantly in some respects, help continue to develop the environment of the ecosystem that attracts more capital and attracts more players? And as you started us off on that, so why don't I ask you to pick up from there?
So I think in terms of economic recovery, if we look back to the 2008 crisis, early stage, seed stage investment was definitely key in propelling the life sciences sector forward and continuing the flow of capital in companies. So I think that any policy that has to do with early stage investment will definitely be key in the economic recovery, and we see in the Quebec government is certainly taking that position. And I think, obviously, preaching to my own choir, I think that this is going to be very important. In a more general term, I think that access to data, now is the time to pivot numerically, and we still haven't really done that. So open up the access to data is going to help make companies better able to be efficient and more productive as well. And access to the healthcare systems of every province is also, so that the innovations that we can bring can be used in real time in the systems is going to be also important.
Didier, how about you from a public policy perspective? Where do you think we should be focusing efforts?
So if we have had that discussion a couple of years ago, I would have really been pointing about, making sure, capital is available in some way through various means. Nowadays, what I really see as a bottleneck, which is also an opportunity for Canada, is really entrepreneurial spirit. Is how do we foster this ability of individuals to take on a dream and move it forward and think big. I'm thinking about Lord Segal, about Ali Tirani. And really, everyone is key to the success of these organizations. But at the end of the day, it is led by a few people that actually have a vision, share their vision, and attract people. So I would say that we perhaps have a unique opportunity to bring back, other Dion Madsen from this world and attract them back to Canada to help us develop that country, because we have the science, and obviously we'll need to continue investing massively in science. We have groups like adMare and others that help, and AmorChem helping bridging, innovation into interesting potential. But at the end of the day, capital will be fine if someone has a good idea and a good story to tell. And the key into that whole equation is really not perhaps fully experience, but it's people that have the desire to take on that idea to the finish line, Clarissa Desjardins and others. So I think that there may be something about in Quebec, for instance, where we have this fiscal credit for researchers. Why not having this fiscal credit for CBOs, for CAOs, coming back and not going back to the old days of hiring US CEOs.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think we have to have a balancing between recruiting back the expats, and I think there continues to be a real opportunity, and we've seen a fair bit of that over the last few years. And as you know, we do a fair bit of work in training future executives.
Absolutely.
Kind of a longer term strategy, which is incredibly important. And I think one of the things that's worked well in that strategy is that we haven't tried to make it a mass appeal kind of thing. We focused on a limited number, no more than 20 a year. So we're really talking about helping people grow in their career, and we've seen the impact of that. So I think obviously I'd echo that totally.
But I don't think it is one or the other. It is both. It is
totally. That's exactly. And I think there's one's an immediate term strategy. I mean, if you're running a company today and you need a C-suite person, and you can't find it domestically, obviously your next bet is to turn to, is there an expat opportunity? And if not, can you recruit somebody from abroad? Longer term, we've got to continue to build that capacity, no question. Dion, being the expat among us, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, the expat is getting recruited back. It's a long process, as Didier knows. When I took over the role at BDC, that was 2013. So 7 years or so of seeing our efforts bear fruit, and then having the opportunity to start Amplitude. But yeah, I think that one of the big challenges that we took on back in 2013, and I have to give full credit to Didier for really starting a lot of this conversation and being the catalyst for a lot of our successful efforts to date. So, full credit to you, Didier, for being a real visionary in this space. But one of the things that we wanted to do was to really change the conversation that we were having with entrepreneurs who had been, I think, beaten down to a point where they were developing business plans to access the amount of capital that they thought they might be able to raise domestically. And that really caused their vision to be diminished. And because of that, they really reduced their opportunity to raise external capital, which was really attracted to much bigger stories. So we said, well, the only way to turn that around is to change that conversation. And instead of asking questions like, oh, who's going to acquire you after your phase 1 study, we changed it around to, what other technologies are you going to acquire that are going to put you in a leadership position in your industry? And that you could just see when you asked that question that people were just like, well, wait, I haven't even thought about that, because no one's ever asked me that question. And every time I brought it up, people, beat it out of me. So once we changed that conversation, and then we had great leaders like Ali and Clarissa that really forged the path. Now every conversation that we have with entrepreneurs comes to us with that, which is like, I want to be like that. So I think AppSeller is a great example of that. When we first started talking with Carl, I think he was very happy with his service company. It was doing very well, great partnerships, they have great technology. But it was an uncomfortable conversation to start to talk about pivoting into becoming a drug developer, because it was something that they had never done before. But the more you talked about it, and the more you said, no, you can do it. We know how to do it. You can do it. And, here's how, and here's some examples, and go to talk to these people. All of a sudden the conversation changed, and this is going to be a very successful company, and likely the next IPO coming out of Canada. So I think you're seeing enough success stories now where you do have that elevated vision, and people have an understanding of that. Now, availability of capital is out there, and people can feel quite encouraged and supported by that when they bring ideas forward. And I would have thought that, 7 years ago, back in 2013, that a company like Deep Genomics could never get funded in Canada. And still, we're the only Canadian investor that's back behind that story. But this could really change the landscape for Canadian drug development, the application of AI and utilizing that to build a full pipeline of products. I think this is going to be a very compelling story in the next 3 years. And I think it will really be one of the first stories that come out around utilizing the tremendous AI resource that we built in Canada. And I think could really create Canada as a global leader in the use of that technology here. unfortunately, we lost one company along the way, right? We lost AtomWise, which was founded in Toronto and moved to the Valley. And, you know, there's a chance maybe to suck those guys back at some point in time and invest back in the space. But I'm pretty excited about what's going on.
It's another conversation I want to return to in a minute, because those are, again, from a public policy perspective, two issues that, or two sectors rather, that public policymakers think a lot about: life sciences and AI or machine learning. So I want to come back to that, but I have to just underline your comment about and Didier's comment about the aspirational approach, because it is so true what you're saying, that a few years ago, companies did the work that they could afford to do based on the money that they could raise, and that is a self-defeating cycle, right? You are taking a high-risk business and making it dramatically higher risk, and I think we've all probably got scar tissue from that kind of thinking, and without question, yeah, we have to collectively change the perspective and encourage our public policymakers to join us in that change. That our vision is Canadian life sciences leading the world. So that means we have to ask ourselves every day on things we're working on: is this going to change the world? Is this going to lead the world? Right? Is this really a world-leading issue? Because everything that we do, that you folks fund, needs to be globally competitive for its relevant. And so I think we need to ask ourselves about all of our policies, about all the work we do: is it really leading the world? Laurence, what's your perspective on that?
I will agree with my colleagues on the points. Yeah, we have models like Larissa and Ali, so people can relate to them. I still think that we have to work to generate more of those, but at least people have models that they can refer and identify themselves to, and they're not sort of the border. So that's good. We have to keep working on that. I will totally agree with Inès about seed funding. It's still scarce. We still need to improve that. If we want to create company, I still think there's scarcity of capital at the beginning. Didier is right. When you get to the next step, a good idea, a good CEO will find the capital, but the early days are still tough. So for me, we still have to improve, and we have a very good tax credit system in Canada for our company. Our government have been doing great on that front, and that's something that we showcase to US investor having a company in Canada. But having said that, I still think right now we have a challenge at the beginning of the food chain, so the seed, and training more CEOs and C-suite directors, but also at the end, that's probably my 10 years as a sell-side analyst, but I think we have to improve the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is a totally different discussion, but for me, it's the beginning and the end of the food chain. In between, we're good. It's beginning and the end that we can still improve. The Toronto Stock Exchange, no surprise. I mean, it's an illiquid stock market. The cost of doing dual listing on Toronto and NASDAQ and the complexity is a burden for its company. So they just go to NASDAQ. And there's no Canadian investor really supporting life science company on that exchange. So if we want to keep some of the company in Canada and being anchors company, we still have to work on that also for me.
Let me just ask, though, I'm reluctant to go down this rabbit hole. Is that opportunity passed? I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where you're physically located to list on NASDAQ. And I suspect we would all agree today that the only market that really effectively values technology stocks broadly is NASDAQ. Are we beyond the point where the TSX can be relevant to innovation companies?
I don't think so, Gord. Personally, I still think it's worth it. It's not only trading and avoiding that the company go to NASDAQ, it's encouraging pension fund in Canada to invest at a stage of the company where you don't have only US that can support those companies. And that it's not too late. It's never too late for that.
Is there, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. You asked the question, is it past the time when they could be relevant? I think they can be relevant. Is it necessary for the success of the industry that they are? No. So I think that I think what's really interesting is we've utilized this as a pathway to get access to growth capital for our companies and to provide pathways to liquidity eventually for the fund. But we used it as a benchmark for global competitiveness. So we said, if our aim is to create globally competitive companies, then our benchmark should be that we can create a company that we could list on NASDAQ or NYSE. And it takes it to a kind of a value level that is really meaningful for potential acquirers as well. And if you're not creating a company that's worth $250 million or $500 million, there's no major acquirer who's going to take a look at it. It doesn't move the needle for them, and they just don't have time and attention for it. So for us, it became an aspirational goal that we could use as a way of both pointing management teams in that direction, but also as a way of when we're selecting companies to add to the portfolio, that we should be using that as a filter. So if Toronto offered great access to capital and was oriented around listing companies that had that kind of thing, then I think that you'd be really indifferent. But the challenge comes when companies that have market caps of less than 50 million are listing on the TSX, and they don't really have the ability to scale much more broadly beyond that. And I think it doesn't necessarily create a catalyst for the development of the industry.
Inès, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the TSX serves as a canary in the coal mine, really. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the late 90s and early aughts, and the problem is the lack of general interest from institutional investors, from bankers, and from the rest of the non-VC ecosystem in our asset class in Canada. So I don't think it's so much about where you should list, because I agree with my colleagues that NASDAQ is probably where everybody wants to go for one reason or another. But the lack of activity on the TSX is also a sign that there's no interest in our asset class outside of the groups that exist, and the ecosystem cannot grow. We cannot continue to foster companies and help them to scale up if there's not a strong financing environment in our geography.
That's interesting. So maybe we can just pivot a little bit off of the exchange to the true large institutional investors. You're one of the few that is so active in that space. What needs to happen to encourage other large institutional investors to engage? I mean, you can't force them. Obviously, they've got to be convinced there's an opportunity to create value. But what's required?
It's the billion-dollar question.
That's why I asked you.
But I would echo that what my colleague said. If you look at what's happening in IT, in information technology, we have a process by which companies now go to TSX, back large institutional investors, and then they go to the NASDAQ, Lightspeed, Shopify, and some others. So this is the route. This is the normal route. We are back to how do you get institutional investors to join the effort. Honestly, I don't know. I've been on a route for years trying to show secretly our returns, spectacular returns in the asset class, to show how we do good by providing new therapy and good returns, and people don't get it. I think it's perceived as pretty risky. It is perceived as requiring a whole specific team that people don't want to build over the years. And actually, they cut off those teams in the early 2000s. So there are many reasons. I think, and that's the trend in institutional investor. I think that the key for me, it's once people will realize that it's not just about financial returns, but it's also about doing good. This will become to be the asset class to look at, because it's very difficult to find another industry where you can do so well on the financial aspect, but also, at the end of the day, we're talking about patients, about lives, and that's touching people directly to their heart. And at the time we hear in 2020, impact investing, that is really the definition of what is impact investing. So I guess, and we go back to policy, in that discussion, I think the government could help into explaining how investor could do their corporate work by helping groups. So talking about life science, talking about environment, which is also not financed enough to really help bring technology that Canada is good at, also bringing good to the society and people. But to the basic answer, I don't know. I've tried and I've failed. So I hope someone can figure out.
I wonder, could you create an ESG kind of bond that would involve a public policy interaction there and if there was a deliverable from a commercial perspective, the public policy makers off the hook?
To me?
Yeah, sure. That's kind of a wacky idea, so help me.
Well, we have seen now some funds reporting how many product they brought to the market, how many people in Canada got as specific access to new developments. So I think there are ways to actually demonstrate that you can contribute to something, and if the government is looking for bringing a solution to the people, there may be some metrics to follow on. I have to say this discussion has to take place along with the pricing, because that is a pretty difficult discussion, as we know. But again, I think we're going to need to find a balance in between all of these, because at the end of the day, there are unmet medical needs. There are people dying of disease, and we need to find some solution. It's an obligation that we have all together.
At the same time, Gord, I think it's the right timing to have that debate, because Inès said earlier that we are not the new kid, but we are the kid on the block right now, life science as an industry. We're not only the kid, we are the good kid right now, where 10 years ago, that was not the case. So the credibility of our sector has improved drastically in the last 9 months. I would say that's a positive coming out of that full mess of the COVID-19, but we should build on that credibility. And as Didier say, here's our role, here's what we can bring to society, and having the full debate back now with the policy. And pricing is part of it. I agree with Didier. It's always a hard discussion to have, but it's part of the discussion.
Well, it's an interesting balance, and maybe I'll ask Dion to comment on this. It's an interesting balance for public policymakers between that pricing discussion, which is obviously critical, both from the payer's perspective, to state the stunningly obvious, and the industry perspective. But you also have to create a commercial environment that is attractive for investment and for people to continue. So, yeah. Dion, what do you think about that question of creating some sort of metric-based bond, or some sort of, it's obviously, I'm freebasing an idea here, but some sort of milestone-based bond that the public policymakers are being engaged with to encourage specific achievements within the industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole bunch of interesting things. So when Ontario launched its Office of Healthcare Innovation, they were trying to tackle this issue. They had, I think the annual healthcare spend in Ontario is something like $55 billion. And they set up this office and they put 8 people in the office. And I was speaking with Bill Chernetsky, who was the head of that. I said, 8 people? Like, if you could change the delta, change the annual spend by 10%, that's $5 billion that you could save. And you're going to put 8 people there. You should have like 1,000 people working on this thing, right? There should be 1,000 people that are working at how do you change things. So I think what you're asking is like this really big question of how do you deliver a high level of health to this incumbent population and all of Canadian citizens in a way that not only manages cost, but also encourages the development of the industry at the same time. I think it's a massive question. And I think you have some lower hanging fruit, which I think is going to be like the domestication of supply chains. So I think you can develop a lot more local sourcing. But around innovative therapies, this is such a global industry that I don't think that you can think that you could satisfy the Canadian market with Canadian innovation, or vice versa, or that the Canadian innovators are going to be satisfied with the Canadian market, right? This is too fluid back and forth. But, you know, people that supply technology or people that manufacture, I think you could start to see more domestication of that. So if I was a policymaker, I would be focused on that area first.
And in terms of public policy, there was the Wiki initiative, right? The first Wiki came out with one life sciences fund, and there's now an effort to try and start that again but with a life sciences focus. So I think that to create funds, create an emerging team or support emerging teams, and to give them an anchorage of a first LP, I think that was an excellent public policy move.
Yeah,
that's already has precedent.
Yeah, I think the data on the venture capital initiative and even the previous program are quite compelling. That's a really effective approach for public policymakers, because they're getting precisely the kind of impact that they want to see, both in terms of the development of the venture capital industry, which is, I'm sure we'd all agree, critically important, but also in the development of the companies themselves.
Right, and I think we would all self-servingly argue that not enough capital has gone towards life sciences through Wiki. I think that's going to change. If you look at the 10-year returns for Canada VC, it's kind of around 8%. And I think that you're going to see that change a little bit, because there's been a lot of tech companies being very successful recently that I think are going to push that up. But Canadian life sciences was 16%. You know, yeah. This is really, really good. And very, very competitive. So I think you're going to see a much more increased allocation towards life sciences in any future Wiki efforts, which I would fully support. But I think you're also starting to see increased institutional interest. The challenge that we've had, and I think it will be echoed by all of the funds that are on the call today, is that there are not any funds of the scale that can absorb money from large institutional investors that have some interest in putting money behind it. But their minimum check size might be somewhere in the $25 to $50 million range. And they just do not want to take that big of a chunk of funds. So I think as funds are successful and start to scale, I think you're going to see much more increased institutional interest in the sector.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, because there are a couple of questions from our audience, and I think it's really important that we engage them in the dialogue. And the first one is taking us in a very different but critically important direction. And I'll read you the question, and I'll answer it first from our perspective. And the question is, where do you see the role of VC in promoting inclusion and diversity, particularly in getting more Indigenous people of color, particularly Black immigrants, to be not only C-suite ready, but to be included in the upper echelons of management and decision making? Please provide examples of tangible steps each of your companies are taking. So let me just talk about that for a moment, because it's a really tough issue, because it's particularly as it relates to some populations, it's a long-term issue. From our perspective, we have been very serious about it. Didier and Laurence will know that our board of directors is 50-50 men and women, and we're very serious in our nominating and governance perspective to identify candidates that reflect the broad diversity of Canada. When you look at our leadership team, it's also it's almost 50-50, not quite, but certainly the senior roles are broadly shared, and we're doing an okay job, to be candid, reflecting the broader diversity of Canada, not as good as we want to. I think when you look at some of the programs that we run, when you look at the Executive Institute, for example, one of the things that we said at the outset in establishing the Executive Institute was that of the 20 candidates every year, there would be 50% women, 50% men, and then it would broadly reflect the diversity of Canada. And I have to say, I think I've probably said this to all of you before, when we first launched that program, and I kept saying that, I have to be honest and admit, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I hope we're able to do that. One of the interesting lessons for us is that it was easy. And one of the reasons I think it was easy is we said it. We said we were going to do it, and that allowed people the freedom to engage and apply for the program, knowing that we were open to that kind of engagement. All of that said, and I'm proud of the work that my colleagues do on this front. All of that said, part of the challenge we're dealing with, it's a longer term issue, and we need to go earlier in both the educational process. We've all talked before about the incredible importance of STEM training for everybody, as well as the career advancement issues. So when you look at the data for this industry, it's actually quite alarming. For entry-level jobs, roughly the industry is 50-50 men. If you just look at it on gender, 50-50 men and women. When you go to the first leadership job, it goes to kind of 60-40. When you go to C-suite, it ends up being 70-30. When you go to CEOs, it's 80-20. And when you go to boards, it's 90-10. That's broad North American data, to be fair, but clearly something we all have to be conscious of. So I think it's a really important issue for us to talk about. Didier, why don't I ask you to start in your perspective on those issues?
Sure. Oh, I won't have any examples. You know, the reality is if we have criteria to the point which we would say no to an investment in a fund or in a company because it does not have that representativity, the answer is no at this time. What is new, and I guess we may be perceived as laggard, is at least we engage the conversation. So what we see in the biotech companies is that it is not a problem for people working in labs, and it becomes quite obvious that when talking about senior management, the bias is starting. So we have that conversation. Can we force the change? No. Can we suggest diversity policies within the board? Yes. But there is a minimum we can do, but there is also a maximum we can do. In terms of funds, I would say it is the same. So I could be very proud of having the first 2 lead women funds. Actually, Inès is part of it. But it was they decided to build it like that. So I cannot claim for the fact that we invested in a women funded fund. It was built like that. So. Again, we engage the conversation. It's more difficult with groups investing in late stage. It is easier with early stage and biotech. Small funds investment, but changing the habit will take substantial amount of time, I guess. I have to say though that in funds and not in biotech, we have already problems. I think my colleagues could echo. We have already problems to find investment professional to actually join funds. So it's not an easy take. So I'm not saying that it's not achievable, but it's an industry that is pretty difficult. And what we do is actually engage the conversation. So we engage ourselves into talking about these, and we did not talk about these in the past. So at least there is an evolution there.
So, Inès, let me turn to you, because Didier kind of stole the segue I was going to use, which is there you are, leading a fund with your business partner, Elizabeth DeVille, 2 women leading a fund, and certainly if you accept, I think you have to accept it. If you can't see it, you can't be it. Give us your perspective on those issues.
I think the perspective comes from being a women-led fund, but it also comes from being an early-stage investor. So it's a little bit easier to take a gamble with new CEOs and new kinds of inexperienced management when you're at our stage than when you are, let's say, at a later stage or Series C kind of company. And what we have to do, and we touched on that earlier on, is really to think of outside the box of the kind of phenotype you need in order to run a biotech company at that stage. And that's the only way that the needle is going to change. Because if you're looking for someone who's had a lot of experience, who started up a bunch of companies, who's raised 50 million or God forbid, came from pharma, you're always going to find exactly the same phenotype of person. Nothing is ever going to change. If you think of it as someone who has the drive, someone who has some kind of technical expertise that's relevant, but not necessarily all the technical expertise that's relevant, and who can push forward a program and be convincing to investors, then all of a sudden the world opens to a whole bunch of people that have different types of experiences and therefore different and represent different kinds of diversity. But I really think it comes from that. It comes from getting out of the mindset of what are we looking for in a CEO or in a C-suite person.
Interesting. Right, I think that's really interesting. And so, Dion, let me ask you, because we've all referenced. How am I doing, Dion? Why don't I turn to you? I drew a blank there, so I'm just going to turn to you and ask you to address that. Clarissa, there's where I was going. Sorry, you invested early in Clarissa. We've all referenced her. Give us your perspective on that.
Right, and thank goodness we did. So I'm really glad the question came up, because I think this is an important question, and it's part of the dialogue. And our industry has been historically bad at this, I have to say. So we've been talking about this for quite a while. When we recruited for a position when we were at the BDC, we had an analyst position open, and we went through our traditional channels and sent it out. And we said, we want to promote diversity, and we ended up with 90% of the applications were from men, some from diverse backgrounds, but 90% from men, 10% from women. So then when we started Amplitude, we said, look, diversity is really important. It's very important to me. I'm a member of the Métis Nation, and I see Indigenous people not well represented in the upper echelons of Canadian business, and specifically not in science, not in the areas that we work in. So we talked about that. So this time when we went out, we said, look, diversity is really important. And if we just do the same thing the same way, we're going to end up with 90% male. So let's do a bunch of outreach ahead of time. Let's reach out to all women in biotech, and let's try to find non-traditional candidates, and let's be active and proactive rather than reactive. And we ended up with 40% of our candidates. And out of our final set of candidates of 4, we had 3 women and 1 male. Did we compromise on quality? Absolutely not. But we were able to find the best qualified candidates out there, and we had the appropriate lens. So we've now gone from like 1 of 4 of our team when we started to now 3 of 8 are diverse candidates, and we need to do more. We just need to be thinking about that at all times, and we need to be thinking about not just when we're hiring, but we need to be thinking about building a fertile ground and going down to the university level, the high school level. Like, we need to be out there promoting interest in science from diverse communities, so that in the long run we can have broad participation in the innovation economy from the entire population of Canadian citizens.
Well put, very well put. Laurence, what's your perspective? Again, like Inès and you and one of your partners, McCauley, widely respected leaders in the space, and also from the perspective of a mom with accomplished daughters in the sciences. Give us your perspective.
Yeah. So actually, we're 4 partners at CTI, so half of it is female. So we're very proud of that. Was it designed like this? No, like Inès explained, it's exactly the same case. But how can we go forward about it, as we are in the same process that Dion was talking about recruiting and building the team for the fund tree. And I will say that we need to have a will. We need to have a will to reach to a proper balance of people. And of course, we never want to, take the balance between quality and diversity. We want to have both, but it is doable, as you said, Gord, earlier. We just have to make that extra effort. But it's still a challenge. We still have to build an industry where young women and diversified people are looking forward to come. They will not see that as a burden and a challenge that they cannot overcome. We have to make them see that. That will be the first step as building our team. I think we have to do the same exercise at board level. We all sit on different boards. When we are looking for board member, we have to make that reach to have that balance in diversity. And same thing in management of companies. So it's all come back to what you say, Gord, it's the wheel. And when you have the wheel, it's getting easier.
It's interesting when I never really thought about it this way before, but we work in an industry where there are lots of reasons not to do something, right? There are a lot of things that are hard, right? And there are a lot of people that will tell you that it can't be done. And what's interesting about some of the solutions that we've talked about today, they're all aspirational solutions. They're just deciding we want to make that change. If it's looking at a molecule or an approach that anybody else has said isn't going to work, and a scientist says I believe it can, or it's creating an anchor company where people say it can't be done. It's the same in this issue. And I just let me finish this part of the discussion on the Indigenous issue specifically, because I think Dion addressed it, and I'd like to add, one of the great privileges that Mari has is we can afford to have a much longer term perspective than most organizations in the space because of how we were created, why we were created. And so we actually have a couple of programs, one of them with high school, Indigenous kids in high school in sciences, because you've got to start early. And that's, again, it's a long-term challenge, but it's, candidly, if you looked at it from an efficiency perspective and you were all business all the time, you'd say it's a drag on our efficiency. Probably is, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. And every time, it's the same with our co-op students we do with from undergrad programs across the country. Our people get enriched, right? Our people get more from that interaction than we get without question. So I thank you for that question. I think it was really important. Let's move on to the second one, which is taking us back to the dark black hole of pricing. So in part of the problem with respect to the difficulty of having discussions on pricing is the drug companies have to recoup the cost for losses. So how should young companies think about that when they're focused on just one innovation? And I think that's maybe allow me the freedom to kind of broaden the question a little further and say, from a public policy perspective, we're talking about a space, young innovative companies that are loss-making for a considerable period of time, and how closely should we relate that innovation investment with that pricing investment? Who wants to start us there? Didier, why don't you start us there? It's a fun subject to dive into.
Well, the advice for the company, they should think first about the problem they are trying to solve. If they are saving lives, if they are extending the life of people more than a week, if they are mostly improving the quality of life, largely reducing the burden for the society to support hospitalization, the cost or the price at the end is not per se an issue. There is a constant pressure, and more important pressure, but the company should really focus on trying to provide a therapy for an unmet medical need. What is bad into the market is this example of multi-million-dollar drug for a few numbers of patients, but these are not the majority of these. These are the extreme of these. So I think it's back to what it solves. If it is an addition, an improvement of something that is already reimbursed and has already a product, the company should not move ahead with this idea. They should be back to what is the problem they're trying to solve, and is that really a problem that represents a huge amount of cost? Adding the social cost to the society.
And so, Inès, let's go from there, because surely one of the questions that you and your colleagues pose often to researchers is the commercial relevance, right? And we all know that there are a lot of really exciting programs, but really the question Didier is asking, is it commercially relevant, and is it going to justify that kind of pricing down the road that the public should be willing to pay because of the problem solving. How do you address that issue with researchers?
Yeah, well, with researchers, it's always a question of adjusting their lens on what they're actually doing and trying to get them, particularly, and this is always a surprise to me, how much how little fundamental researchers speak to clinicians and really understand where their product is going to be placed in standard of care. It's not only about having a good biological target or a good answer with respect to toxicity or whatever other parameter. It's really about what does the clinician need, what does the patient need in real time. So this is a question that we focus on, you're right, very early on when we start diligence, not so much necessarily with pricing in mind, because we're so early stage that we can, push those questions off to a little bit later, but in terms of the commercialization and in terms of what kind of interest are we going to generate with that product, and is any pharma eventually, or any venture capitalist later stage eventually going to want to spend the money it's going to take to develop this? Is the impact of it going to be large enough to warrant that investment? And it's not an easy conversation to have with fundamental researchers who don't think of the world that way, and thank God, because you have to broaden your research scope. And it's those who understand that point that we have success with.
So Dion, what if we look at it from one of the interesting areas? You're focused a lot on precision medicine. I think that's actually how you introduced your fund. And one of the interesting economic development opportunities for Canada, I would argue, is a real strength in the fundamentals of precision medicine, and an opportunity, and from a public policy perspective, willingness to invest in the manufacturing that's necessary to support precision medicine. But that also assumes a certain level of pricing commitment, both domestically and globally. So how do you look at those issues?
Yeah, I think the logic behind precision medicine means that these larger, more monolithic conditions start to get broken down into much more individualized components, and you start to treat them much better. The challenge comes when you have things that are curative of chronic conditions, because people are very used to paying, $500 a month for a therapy that you're going to take for the next 30 years. And then you come up to them and you say, oh, I can solve that. You can take this one time and then you're cured, and you don't have to take anything else for the rest of your life. But, oh, it's going to cost you $2 million. Then people go like, whoa, okay, I can't do that. And, hepatitis C being a great example of that. Where a country might look at that differently than a US insurance company, because the country has the citizen for the rest of their life, but the insurance company has that patient for a year or two, right? So they're like, oh, we're not going to pay all of that. So I think you're seeing the development of really innovative pricing models there that I think will be capturing this. And we had predicted quite a while ago that you were going to be shifting into what I would call value-based pricing across many different conditions. And I think you could just see what was happening in the UK around the NICE and say, well, that's definitely coming to the rest of the world, and then eventually to the US as well, in that you're going to have to prove efficacy of your drug before you're going to be able to get reimbursement for it. And you're going to have to come up with some methodology around that. And that feeds very nicely into this idea of precision medicine, because you're going to be able to detect which patients should respond well to your therapy. So that loop becomes very virtuous, in that you can have the appropriate diagnostic, identify the patient that's going to respond to your drug, and then you can quantify some of the cost benefits that are around that. So I think it bodes well for the development of very economically advantageous therapies coming to the Canadian market from these innovations, but also the development of great companies here.
So it's really interesting, when you think about the introduction of NICE, and basically all the industry said for probably 5 years was that NICE is nice, right? And they attacked the process and they tried to, and here we are, what are we, 10 or 12 years later, I think, actively engaged the way that you're describing it in really being able to demonstrate value. Do you see those same things, Laurence?
Yeah, I think we have to adapt the model around the pricing and the way we work around the pricing. And Dion just talk about, proving efficacy before you get a reimbursement. We saw that with cell therapy, which are very costly treatment. We're going to see that more and more. I also think that part of the equation sometimes is because drugs are not pricing enough and pharma are not making enough money. So we have to think about that model as well. And there is an interesting one, again, in UK, Dion. And that model is what they call the Netflix model for antibiotics. We know that there is no antibiotic that are developed. So they're putting us in place what they call the Netflix. So it's a subscription, and the government take a subscription with AstraZeneca or Novartis or who else, and they do an upfront payment, and then they have the obligation to buy a certain number of pills and antibiotics. And I think that will decrease the price, but although at the same time, the discovery of new drugs where the pharma is saying, I'm not going there because I don't have the price that I need to be profitable. So I think we're going to see more and more stuff like that.
That's pretty interesting. So we're down to our last few minutes. Let me go around the virtual table with a last question. We're really practical for two groups: the young or the emerging innovative scientists, particularly around the relationship question. We touched on that earlier. One of the challenges in trying to find funding for a program, I'm pretty sure we would all advocate building relationships over a long period of time, but you should be doing that long before you actually need money. How would you give them advice what advice would you be giving them to establish those relationships? How should they go about doing it? It's an issue I worry a lot about, frankly. And similarly for young scientists who use events like the Canadian Science Policy Conference or other, the Neuroscience Conference or whatever, as an opportunity to find, if not mentors, some mentorship, and those face-to-face opportunities are gone, I would argue, certainly for the next 12 months. What sort of advice would you give to that? Yeah, why don't I start with you?
Thanks for that. I think maybe Inès has a better perspective because that's where she is every day. But we do all sorts of things to build relationships. One of the really interesting projects that we did recently was we know some of the, let's call them the wiser leaders of the scientific establishment in Canada. We know who they are, and they were sitting in endowed chairs across the country, and they maybe have started companies already, and we've worked with them that way. So we said, we know who those people are, but we don't know who the emerging next generation of leaders are. So let's try to find out who they are. So we did a big data review of all the scientific publications that had a Canadian institution labeled into them, a subset of the scientific publications, and then keywords in the precision medicine areas that we're looking for. And this service just ingested all of those and then ranked those by how important they were, how often they were cited, and so on. And we came up with a list of innovators in Canada, some of which we knew, some of which we didn't. And we did active outreach to build relationships with those. So I guess I would turn the relationship back the other way, is that the best way to be doing this is to be doing some really interesting and innovative research, and that will be discovered. So, if you are that person doing that, then talk to the academic leadership at your university, get connected up with other alumni who are out now running companies and started companies, and start that dialogue, and then use that as a bridge, because that will be a nice reference point into VCs as you start thinking about your business and start thinking about where you might take your career. And the other part, and this is where we're starting to encourage a lot more, cross-fertilization between academia, commercialization, and the financing environment, is to start to look for opportunities just to spend time with either VCs or with companies as unpaid internships or active internships, where you are looking to provide some kind of translation experience. So either translating innovation from academia to commercialization, or assisting on diligence, but just make yourself available as a resource, and then that becomes a two-way learning.
Great. I think that's very good advice. Inès?
Yeah, and I think, Gord, if I may, that brings exactly the next point, which is building that relationship. Don't talk about cross-fertilization. You have to show those researchers, their future leaders, that you understand what they're about, what they do, that you embrace what they do. But I think one of the weakness from a VC point of view is we're trying to protect ourselves a lot. So usually when we don't invest in a project, we don't detail it. So when you go back to the researcher, they don't care, they don't understand. It's part of building. So sometimes give time, give advice, give them, it's not you, it's the wrong timing for me now, it's the fund is not there. You can take the time, and I think that will go a long way to build relationships, so the academic will understand our own constraint, and we have to do a better job at that. The email saying, sorry, you don't meet our criteria for now is kind of really broad and doesn't help.
It's not you, it's me. Didier, what's your perspective on that?
Well, on the company fundraising, the advice I would say is never ask for money, ask for advice, because the people you're going to be approaching, they like to talk, they like to share the knowledge, and they will help you. And
present company excluded.
And if they have something interesting, they'll get back to you. So the reality is it's rare that a cold call turns into a term sheet that turns into an investment. This is an abnormality. It's about relationship and engaging, asking for advice. And true people, true investor looking forward to build a community will spend time to provide advice.
I think that's great advice. Inès, last word to you.
Well, I just say you're all making great points, and it all really starts know your audience, and now's the time to take the time to understand how VC works and what as Laurence was saying, what our own constraints are. And when you come to talk to us, understand how we built our portfolio and who's part of our team and how we can be helpful. That's, I think, part of the work has to be done on the other side. And there's still a ton of mentorship programs. There's a lot of effort is being done in the education of biotech entrepreneurs. Montréal in Vivo has a program with Concordia. You guys run programs as well as at adMare. So take advantage of these things, and that's how you meet us. That's how you get to meet VCs and to just ask questions.
That's great advice. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate each of you taking so much of your time to engage in it. I know that the audience, both live today and over the next week at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, very much appreciates it as well. So thank you, and that brings us to a close.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.